At my sister Rachel's engagement party at the prestigious Riverside Country Club, the host made elaborate introductions for every single family member in the grand ballroom. Uncle Tony, the successful restaurant owner. Aunt Susan, the celebrated nurse practitioner. Cousin Jessica, the rising marketing executive. Cousin Mark, the promising engineering student. Even my parents got their moment of recognition as Robert and Linda Chen, the proud entrepreneurs who built their Vietnamese restaurant empire from nothing. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. But when it came to me, Maya Chen, sitting right there in my navy blazer at table 3, the host simply skipped over me entirely and moved on to introducing the Morrison family. Not a word, not even an acknowledgement that I existed. The room full of Portland's elite didn't even glance in my direction. That's when David Morrison's father, Judge William Morrison of the Federal Circuit Court, leaned over to his son with genuine curiosity written across his weathered face and said in a voice that carried across the suddenly quiet room, "Where exactly is the Supreme Court Justice? I've been looking forward to meeting her all evening." The silence that followed was so complete you could hear the Columbia River flowing outside those floor-to-ceiling windows. Every head in that ballroom turned. Every conversation stopped mid-sentence. Every champagne glass paused halfway to lips. Because you see, nobody in my family had bothered to tell the Morrisons that their honored guest, the youngest Associate Justice in Oregon Supreme Court history, was the same person they'd just made invisible at her own sister's celebration. My name is Maya Chen, and from wherever you're watching this, stay with me. Because what happened next exposed years of family dynamics that I'd been too blind to see, and changed everything about how I understood my place in the world. Have you ever been in a room where everyone who raised you, everyone who supposedly loves you, treats you like you're invisible while simultaneously benefiting from everything you've accomplished? That night at the Riverside Country Club, I learned the difference between being family and being valued. The confusion on Judge Morrison's face was genuine and innocent. He'd been told by his son David that the Chen family included a Supreme Court justice, and, naturally, he'd assumed it would be introduced with great fanfare. After all, having a state Supreme Court justice in your family isn't exactly common. He'd even prepared talking points about recent constitutional cases and judicial precedent. He'd been genuinely excited to meet a colleague, especially one so accomplished at such a young age. But as his eyes scanned the room looking for this mysterious justice, and as the silence stretched longer and more uncomfortable, I watched my sister Rachel's face drain of color. David looked like he'd been struck by lightning. My parents exchanged those quick, panicked glances that meant they'd made a serious miscalculation. Because the truth was, they'd invited Judge Morrison specifically because they wanted to impress him with their family's success, but they'd somehow convinced themselves that my position was just a side note, not worth highlighting. I remained seated, my hands folded calmly in my lap, watching this moment unfold with the kind of detached fascination you might have watching a car accident in slow motion. Rachel had spent months planning this party, obsessing over every detail from the imported orchids to the 7-course tasting menu. She'd hired a professional event coordinator, insisted on the most expensive ballroom at the country club, and made sure every prominent family in Portland society received an invitation. But in all her planning, in all her careful orchestration of this perfect evening, she'd somehow forgotten to mention that her older sister was the youngest person ever appointed to the state's highest court. The host, a nervous young woman with a clipboard, who'd clearly been given specific instructions about who to highlight, looked around desperately for guidance. You could see her mental calculation happening in real time. She'd been told to skip over one of the Chen daughters because she was just Maya, she keeps to herself anyway. Those had been Rachel's exact words during the planning meeting, I learned later. Just Maya. As if my entire career, my decade of public service, my appointment by the governor herself, was somehow less noteworthy than Mark's engineering degree that he hadn't even finished yet. Judge Morrison, bless his professional instincts, didn't let the awkward silence continue. He stood up from his seat at the head table, adjusted his formal jacket, and addressed the room with the authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention in courtrooms. "Perhaps there's been some confusion," he said, his voice carrying the kind of measured dignity that comes from 30 years on the bench. "I was specifically looking forward to meeting Justice Chen tonight. David mentioned she'd be here, and I've followed her recent opinions with great interest, particularly her work on environmental law and indigenous rights." That's when every eye in the room turned to me. Not gradual recognition, but sudden, snapping attention like a spotlight had just been turned on. I felt the weight of 80-plus gazes landing on my face, saw the wheels turning in minds that had categorized me as the quiet sister, the one who didn't make waves, the one who showed up to family events but never demanded attention. I watched as recognition dawned across familiar faces. Uncle Tony's mouth actually fell open. Aunt Susan gripped her pearl necklace. Cousin Jessica looked like she was trying to solve a complex math problem in her head. My parents, Robert and Linda Chen, had built their restaurant business through decades of careful relationship building and community respect. They understood social dynamics, they understood the importance of reputation, and they understood that this moment could either be handled with grace or become a catastrophe. Dad started to stand, probably to make some elaborate explanation, but I raised my hand gently, and he froze mid-motion. I stood slowly, smoothed my navy blazer, and walked the 15 feet from table 3 to where Judge Morrison waited. Every step was deliberate, unhurried, professional. This wasn't about drama or making a scene. This was about dignity and truth. When I reached him, I extended my hand with a slight smile that I'd perfected during countless formal judicial events. "Judge Morrison," I said, my voice carrying easily across the silent ballroom. "I'm Maya Chen, Associate Justice of the Oregon Supreme Court. It's an honor to finally meet you. I've read your opinions on federal jurisdiction with great admiration, particularly your recent decision in the water rights case." The handshake that followed lasted exactly the appropriate amount of time, firm and respectful. Judge Morrison's face lit up with genuine pleasure, the kind of expression legal professionals get when they meet a respected colleague. "Justice Chen," he replied, "the honor is entirely mine. Your dissent in the Portland development case was brilliant. I shared it with my entire staff as an example of constitutional reasoning at its finest." The conversation that followed was natural, professional, and completely ignored the 90 other people in the room who were watching like we were performing theater. We discussed recent cases, shared perspectives on judicial philosophy, and discovered mutual colleagues from the legal community. For those 10 minutes, I wasn't the overlooked sister or the family afterthought. I was exactly who I'd worked for 15 years to become. A respected jurist having a collegial conversation with another respected jurist. But I was acutely aware of my family's faces throughout this exchange. Rachel looked like she was watching her carefully planned party slip through her fingers. David seemed torn between pride in his father's obvious respect for me, and panic about what this meant for his family's perception of the Chens. My parents wore expressions I'd never seen before, a mixture of pride and something that looked almost like fear. Because for the first time in years, they were seeing me as others saw me, not through the lens of family dynamics that had frozen me in place. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As the responsible older sister who took care of things quietly while Rachel got the attention and accolades. The other guests had begun whispering among themselves, conversations buzzing with the kind of energy that comes when people realize they've witnessed something significant. Portland's legal community isn't that large, and many of the guests knew exactly who Justice Maya Chen was, even if the Chen family had somehow managed to keep that information compartmentalized. I could hear fragments of conversations, people putting pieces together, realizing that the quiet woman they'd barely noticed was someone they'd been reading about in the newspaper for months. Judge Morrison, completely oblivious to the family drama unfolding around us, continued our conversation with the kind of enthusiasm that comes from unexpected professional connection. "I have to ask," he said, lowering his voice slightly, "how do you manage the workload? I know the Supreme Court's docket has been particularly challenging this year, especially with the environmental cases coming up from the appellate level." I found myself relaxing into the conversation, remembering why I loved the law, why I'd spent years building my career, why the appointment to the Supreme Court had felt like the culmination of everything I'd worked toward. The environmental docket is complex, I agreed, but it's exactly the kind of work that drew me to constitutional law in the first place. The intersection of federal and state authority, indigenous sovereignty, and environmental protection creates fascinating legal questions. As we talked, I noticed Rachel approaching with David beside her, both wearing the kind of forced smiles that suggested they'd been having an urgent whispered conversation about how to handle this situation. Rachel's event coordinator hovered nearby, probably wondering if she should somehow retroactively fix the introduction disaster or pretend it never happened. "Dad?" David said, interrupting our conversation with the kind of careful politeness that meant he was operating in damage control mode. "I see you've met Maya. She's Rachel's sister." Judge Morrison looked between David and me with obvious confusion. "Yes, we've been having a wonderful conversation about constitutional law. But David, you never mentioned that Justice Chen was Rachel's sister. What a remarkable family connection." He turned back to me with renewed interest. "David has told us so much about Rachel's family, about the restaurant business and the entrepreneurial success. But he somehow failed to mention that his future sister-in-law sits on the state's highest court." The silence that followed was different from the earlier shocked quiet. This was the silence of people realizing that a significant oversight had occurred, and that the oversight reflected poorly on everyone involved except the person who'd been overlooked. Rachel's smile became even more strained. David looked like he wanted to disappear into the marble floor. "Well," Rachel said with forced brightness, "Maya's always been very private about her work. She doesn't like to make a big deal about these things." Judge Morrison's eyebrows raised slightly, the kind of expression that suggested he was beginning to understand that something unusual was happening here. "Private?" he repeated. "Justice Chen, in my experience, judicial service is inherently public. Your recent opinion on educational funding was covered extensively in the legal journals. Are you saying your family doesn't follow your cases?" I felt a moment of genuine sympathy for Rachel, watching her realize that her attempt to minimize my career had just been challenged by someone who clearly understood the significance of Supreme Court service. But my sympathy was tempered by years of exactly this dynamic, years of my accomplishments being treated as inconvenient complications rather than achievements worth celebrating. "My family has always been very supportive," I said diplomatically, which was technically true even if it left out the part where their support was quiet, private, and came with the clear expectation that I wouldn't make my success anyone else's problem. "They understand that I prefer to let my work speak for itself." Judge Morrison nodded approvingly. "Admirable. Though I have to say, if my daughter were appointed to the Supreme Court, I'd probably have trouble talking about anything else." He looked around the elegant ballroom with its crystal chandeliers and Columbia River view. "In fact, I'm surprised this celebration isn't partially in honor of your appointment. When was that? 6 months ago?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, because the truth was, there had been no celebration of my appointment. There had been a brief congratulations at Sunday dinner, a few proud phone calls to relatives, and then business as usual. Rachel's engagement, announced 3 months after my appointment, had immediately become the family's focus, the thing worth planning and celebrating and investing in. My swearing-in ceremony had been attended by my parents and Rachel, who spent most of it checking her phone and left immediately afterward to meet David for dinner. 7 months, I corrected gently. And tonight is rightfully about Rachel and David. Their engagement is what we're here to celebrate. But Judge Morrison wasn't letting it go. 7 months, he repeated thoughtfully. "You know, Justice Chen, I remember reading about your appointment in the legal news. Youngest appointee in state history, I believe? And your background in environmental law was particularly impressive to those of us who follow these things. Your confirmation hearings were remarkably smooth, if I recall correctly." Each detail he mentioned was another reminder of the achievement that my family had somehow managed to treat as routine. Rachel's face was getting redder, David looked increasingly uncomfortable, and my parents had started that parental calculation of how to fix a situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond their control. "Maya's always been an overachiever," Rachel said with a laugh that sounded forced even to my ears. "We're all very proud of her, of course, but tonight is really about celebrating David and me." Judge Morrison's expression shifted slightly, And I could see him beginning to understand the dynamics at play. 30 years on the federal bench had given him considerable experience reading people and situations. "Of course," he said smoothly. "Forgiveness me for getting carried away. It's just rare to meet a colleague in a social setting, particularly one whose work I've followed with such interest." The conversation might have ended there, with polite redirections back to the engagement celebration, if Aunt Susan hadn't chosen that moment to approach our group with her characteristic lack of filter and her third glass of champagne. "Maya," she said loudly enough for half the ballroom to hear, "I had no idea Judge Morrison knew about your little job. Rachel didn't mention you'd be talking shop tonight." Little job. The words hung in the air like a slap. I felt my carefully maintained composure waver for just a moment, long enough for Judge Morrison to catch the expression that crossed my face. Little job. As if serving on the Supreme Court of Oregon was something I did as a hobby, a side project that might be mildly interesting to legal professionals, but certainly nothing worth dwelling on at a family celebration. Judge Morrison's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: surprise, confusion, and then something that looked distinctly like disapproval. "Little job?" he repeated, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made courtrooms fall silent. "Aunt Susan, I'm not sure I understand. Justice Chen serves on the highest court in the state. She makes decisions that affect millions of Oregonians. In what sense is Supreme Court service a little job?" The question was asked with genuine curiosity, but the tone carried an edge that suggested Judge Morrison was beginning to form some opinions about the Chen family dynamics. Aunt Susan, suddenly aware that she might have misspoken, looked around for support that wasn't coming. "Well," she stammered, "I just meant that Maya's always been so quiet about it. She never talks about work at family dinners. It's not like she's always bringing up cases or anything like that." "I see," Judge Morrison said thoughtfully. "And do you discuss your work at family dinners, Aunt Susan?" The question was pointed enough that even champagne-enhanced Aunt Susan could recognize she was being challenged. "I'm a nurse practitioner," she said defensively. "I help people every day in my clinic." "Admirable work," Judge Morrison agreed. "Essential work. And I imagine your family celebrates your contributions to healthcare?" He paused just long enough to let that sink in. "Just as I imagine they celebrate Justice Chen's contributions to jurisprudence and constitutional law?" The silence that followed was the kind that makes everyone present realize they're witnessing something significant. Judge Morrison had just politely but firmly called out the family's treatment of my career, and he'd done it in front of enough people that it couldn't be ignored or minimized later. Rachel, clearly recognizing that her engagement party was veering into territory she hadn't planned for, stepped forward with her brightest smile. "Judge Morrison, would you like to meet some of our other guests? The mayor is here tonight, and I know he'd love to discuss the city's legal challenges with you." It was a smooth attempt at redirection, and Judge Morrison was gracious enough to allow it. "Of course," he said, but before moving away, he turned back to me one more time. "Justice Chen, I hope we'll have the opportunity to continue our conversation later this evening, and perhaps you'd consider speaking at our judicial conference next month. We're always looking for distinguished colleagues to share their perspectives on constitutional interpretation." The invitation was professional, respectful, and completely normal between judicial colleagues. But in the context of my family's treatment, it felt like validation from someone who understood the real significance of my work. "I'd be honored to consider it, Judge Morrison. Please have your staff send me the details." As he walked away with Rachel and David, I found myself standing alone in the middle of the ballroom, acutely aware that something fundamental had shifted in the evening's dynamics. The conversations around me had resumed, but they were different now. People were looking at me differently. The invisible sister had become visible, and not just because of my title, but because of how stark the contrast had become between how my family treated my accomplishments and how the outside world viewed them. My parents approached cautiously, wearing expressions I recognized from childhood moments when they weren't sure if they should be proud or concerned about something I'd done. "Maya," my mother said quietly, "Judge Morrison seems very impressed with your work." "He's a respected federal judge," I replied evenly. "His opinion carries considerable weight in the legal community." "Of course," my father added quickly. "We've always been proud of your success. You know that. I looked at them both, these people who'd raised me, supported my education, celebrated my law school graduation, and somehow managed to treat my appointment to the Supreme Court as just another milestone that didn't require much attention. I know you're proud, I said gently, but being proud and showing pride are different things. The conversation might have continued, but Cousin Mark chose that moment to join us, with his characteristic ability to miss social cues entirely. So Maya, he said with genuine curiosity, what exactly do you do as a Supreme Court justice? Like, do you actually send people to jail? Or is it more like being a really fancy lawyer? The question was innocent enough, but it revealed something that had been bothering me for months without my fully realizing it. My own family didn't actually understand what I did for a living. They knew I was a judge, they knew it was important, but they'd never bothered to learn the specifics of Supreme Court work, the difference between trial courts and appellate courts, or why constitutional interpretation mattered. The Supreme Court doesn't conduct trials, Mark, I explained patiently. We review decisions made by lower courts to ensure they comply with constitutional law. We interpret statutes, resolve conflicts between different areas of law, and establish precedents that guide future legal decisions throughout the state. Mark nodded like he was following along, but I could see the glazed expression that meant he was already losing interest. So you're like the boss of all the other judges? Not exactly. It's more collaborative than hierarchical. We work as a panel to analyze complex legal questions and issue opinions that clarify how the law should be applied. Cool, Mark said with the kind of enthusiasm that meant he was ready to change the subject. Hey, did you try the salmon? The catering here is incredible. And just like that, the conversation moved away from my career and back to the party. The food, the venue, the normal social pleasantries that made up family gatherings. But I remained standing there, watching Mark walk away to find the salmon station, realizing that this was exactly how it always went. Brief acknowledgement of my work, followed by immediate redirection to topics that felt more accessible, more relatable, more worthy of sustained attention. The evening continued around me with its carefully orchestrated elegance. The string quartet played softly in the corner, guests moved between the bar and the appetizer stations, and conversations flowed with the kind of practiced social ease that comes with events at places like the Riverside Country Club. But I felt disconnected from it all, observing rather than participating, analyzing the dynamics I'd been part of for so long without really seeing them clearly. That's when David's mother, Patricia Morrison, approached me with the kind of purpose that suggested she'd been building up to this conversation. Patricia was elegant in the way that comes from decades of legal community social events, perfectly styled silver hair, and a classic black dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Justice Chen, she said warmly, I hope you'll forgive my husband's enthusiasm earlier. He gets quite excited when he meets judicial colleagues, especially ones whose work he admires. No apology necessary, I replied. It's always a pleasure to meet fellow members of the bench. Patricia smiled, but there was something calculating in her expression. I have to admit, I was surprised when David first mentioned that Rachel's sister was a Supreme Court justice. He spoke so much about the restaurant business and the family's entrepreneurial success, but the judicial appointment seemed to be mentioned almost as an afterthought. The observation was carefully phrased, but I could hear the question underneath it. Patricia Morrison had spent 30 years as a federal judge's wife, navigating the social complexities of the legal community, and she understood that Supreme Court appointments weren't typically treated as afterthoughts by families who understood their significance. My family has always been very grounded, I said diplomatically. They don't let professional achievements overshadow personal relationships. Admirable, Patricia agreed, but her tone suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. Though I have to say, when our son was elected to the State Bar Association board, we probably talked about it for months. I can't imagine how we'd contain ourselves if he were appointed to the Supreme Court. The comparison was pointed but delivered with enough social grace that it didn't feel like an attack. Patricia was simply highlighting what she saw as an unusual family dynamic, the kind of observation that comes from someone accustomed to legal families, where professional achievements are typically celebrated prominently. Every family handles success differently, I replied, maintaining my diplomatic tone even as I felt the truth of her observation settling uncomfortably in my chest. Of course, Patricia said smoothly. And speaking of success, William mentioned that you'd consider speaking at the judicial conference next month. I do hope you'll accept. Your perspective on environmental constitutional law would be invaluable, particularly given the cases coming up on the docket this year. The conversation was perfectly professional, exactly the kind of exchange I might have with any colleague's spouse at a legal community event. But it highlighted something that had been gnawing at me all evening. Patricia Morrison, who'd met me 20 minutes ago, was treating my career with more interest and respect than my own family had shown in months. As she excused herself to rejoin other guests, I found myself alone again, watching the party flow around me with new eyes. Rachel moved through the crowd like the star she'd always been, gracious and charming and perfectly comfortable being the center of attention. David followed her lead, introducing her to various guests, sharing the story of their engagement, discussing their wedding plans with the kind of enthusiasm that comes from being genuinely excited about your future. But I noticed something else as I watched them work the room. Every introduction was about Rachel and David, their careers, their plans, their relationship. When people asked about the family, the conversation focused on the restaurant business, on my parents' entrepreneurial success, on various cousins and their achievements. But my name never came up. My career never entered the conversation. It was as if Justice Maya Chen and Maya the sister existed in completely separate universes, and only one of them was welcome at family celebrations. The realization settled over me gradually, not as a sudden shock but as a slow recognition of something I'd been unconsciously aware of for months. My family wasn't intentionally dismissive of my career. They simply didn't know how to process it. Supreme Court justice didn't fit into their understanding of success, their vocabulary of achievement, their comfortable narrative about who we were as a family. They could talk proudly about the restaurants because they understood restaurants. They could celebrate Rachel's marketing career because marketing made sense to them, involved skills they could visualize and appreciate. But constitutional law, judicial opinions, appellate procedure, the intricate work of interpreting statutes and establishing legal precedent, that existed in a world they didn't understand, and therefore couldn't quite acknowledge as real. I was pulled from these thoughts by the sound of my name being called across the ballroom. Judge Morrison was returning, this time with a small group of people I recognized from Portland's legal community. "Justice Chen," he said warmly, "I was just telling Attorney General Williams about your recent opinion on municipal authority. She's been dealing with similar issues at the state level." The conversation that followed was exactly what I'd been missing without realizing it. Professional colleagues discussing the substance of my work, debating legal interpretations, asking thoughtful questions about judicial reasoning. For 30 minutes I was in my element, discussing the law with people who understood its complexities and appreciated its importance. But even as I enjoyed the conversation, I was aware of my family watching from various points around the room. They looked proud but also confused, as if they were seeing a version of me they didn't recognize. Rachel in particular seemed torn between pleasure at having such distinguished guests at her party and discomfort at having the focus shift away from her engagement. When the legal discussion finally wound down and the group dispersed, I found myself face to face with Rachel for the first time since the evening began. She looked beautiful in her designer dress, radiant with the particular glow that comes from being celebrated and loved and completely secure in your place in the world. "Maya," she said, and I could hear the mixture of emotions in her voice. "I'm glad you and Judge Morrison hit it off. David's father can be pretty intimidating, but you seemed really comfortable with him." "He's a colleague," I said simply. "We have a lot in common professionally." Rachel nodded, but I could see her struggling with something. "I guess I never really thought about it that way," she admitted. "The whole judge thing, I mean. Like, I knew it was important, obviously, but I didn't realize other judges would be so interested in talking to you about it." The whole judge thing. The phrase echoed in my mind, another example of how my family minimized what I did without even realizing they were doing it. But looking at Rachel's face, seeing her genuine confusion, I realized that her dismissiveness wasn't malicious. It was just ignorant. She literally didn't understand what Supreme Court service meant, what kind of achievement it represented, why other legal professionals would treat it with such respect. "Rachel," I said gently, "being appointed to the Supreme Court is considered the pinnacle of a legal career. It's something most attorneys dream about but very few ever achieve. Judge Morrison's interest isn't unusual. It's normal professional courtesy between colleagues. Rachel's face went through several expressions as she processed this information. I guess I never thought about it like that, she said again. I mean, you never talk about work stuff at family dinners. You never seem like you want to discuss it. And there it was. The assumption that had shaped years of family interactions. Because I didn't bring up my work at family dinners. Because I didn't demand attention for my achievements. Because I preferred to listen rather than dominate conversations. My family had concluded that my career wasn't something I wanted to celebrate or discuss. I don't talk about work at family dinners, I said carefully, because no one ever asks. The words hung between us like a revelation. Rachel's face changed as she thought back through months and years of family gatherings, Sunday dinners, holiday celebrations. I could see her mentally reviewing conversations, realizing that her statement was true. They talked about the restaurants, about her marketing campaigns, about various family members' lives and achievements and challenges, but no one had ever asked me about Supreme Court cases, about the intellectual challenges of constitutional interpretation, about what it felt like to help shape legal precedent for the entire state. Oh, Rachel said quietly. Oh, Maya, I didn't realize. It's okay, I said, and meant it. I'm not angry, Rachel. I'm just tired of being invisible. The conversation might have continued, might have evolved into the kind of honest family discussion that changes relationships forever, but at that moment the event coordinator appeared with urgent whispers about the cake-cutting ceremony and the schedule for toasts. Rachel was pulled away into the logistics of her celebration, and I was left standing alone again, watching the woman I'd supported and celebrated my entire life manage the details of her perfect evening. But something had shifted in those few minutes of conversation with Rachel. Not resolution, not complete understanding, but acknowledgment. She'd heard what I was saying, even if she didn't fully grasp its implications yet. And that was more than I'd had before tonight. As the evening moved toward its formal conclusion, as guests gathered for toasts and cake cutting and the traditional celebration rituals, I found myself thinking about choices. The choice to stay invisible, to keep peace by staying small, to continue being the accommodating sister who didn't make waves. Or the choice to be fully present, to claim space, to insist that my achievements deserved recognition not because I was demanding it, but because they were objectively worthy of respect. Judge Morrison appeared beside me one more time as the evening wound down. Justice Chen, he said quietly, I hope tonight hasn't been too uncomfortable for you. Family dynamics can be complicated, especially when professional achievements create new social dynamics. His observation was tactful but perceptive. Thank you for your kindness tonight, Judge Morrison. Your recognition meant a great deal. Not kindness, he corrected gently. Simple professional courtesy. You've earned every bit of respect you've received, and frankly, you deserve considerably more. As he walked away to rejoin his family, I realized that tonight had been a turning point, though not the kind I could have anticipated. I'd learned something important about how the outside world viewed my achievements, and I'd learned something equally important about how my family's treatment of those achievements appeared to others who understood their significance. The question now was what I planned to do with that knowledge. The morning after Rachel's engagement party arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that comes after a storm. I woke up in my downtown Portland condo with Judge Morrison's words echoing in my mind, not just what he'd said, but how he'd said it. The genuine confusion in his voice when he'd asked where the Supreme Court justice was. The professional respect in his tone when we'd discussed constitutional law. The barely concealed disapproval when he'd witnessed my family's casual dismissal of my career. I made my coffee and stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Willamette River, watching early morning joggers cross the Hawthorne Bridge. My phone sat silent on the kitchen counter, which was unusual. Typically, the morning after any Chen family gathering brought a flurry of text messages. Thank you notes, photo sharing, commentary about the event, plans for future get-togethers. The Chen family group chat would normally be buzzing with activity by 8 a.m. But today, nothing. Complete radio silence. I finished my coffee and began my usual Sunday morning routine, reviewing cases for the upcoming week, preparing notes for oral arguments, reading through legal briefs that required my attention. This was the work that Judge Morrison had called essential, the constitutional interpretation that affected millions of Oregonians, the careful legal reasoning that other judges followed with interest. Yet somehow, in my family's universe, this was the career that barely registered as worth discussing. At 10:30, my phone finally buzzed. A single text from Rachel. "Thanks for coming last night. Hope you enjoyed yourself." The message was polite, distant, completely devoid of the usual Chen family warmth. No mention of our conversation, no acknowledgment of what had happened with Judge Morrison, no reference to the obvious tension that had developed throughout the evening. Just a formal thank you note, the kind you might send to an acquaintance who'd attended your party out of obligation. I stared at that message for a long time, recognizing it as a choice point. I could respond with equal politeness, pretend that nothing significant had occurred, allow the family dynamics to reset to their comfortable pattern, where my achievements remained invisible, and everyone could avoid the awkward questions that Judge Morrison had raised, or I could address what had actually happened. I chose a middle path. It was lovely to see everyone. Judge Morrison was particularly engaging to talk with. The response came back immediately. Yes, he seemed to really like talking shop with you. Talking shop? As if constitutional law were a hobby, a casual interest, something equivalent to discussing recipes or gardening tips. I felt that familiar tightness in my chest, the same feeling I'd experienced countless times over the past 7 months, whenever my Supreme Court appointment was treated as a minor detail rather than a major life achievement. But this time I decided to push back gently. Constitutional interpretation is a bit more than shop talk, Rachel. Judge Morrison and I were discussing cases that will shape legal precedent for decades. The typing indicators appeared and disappeared several times, suggesting Rachel was composing and deleting responses. Finally, of course, I didn't mean to minimize it. You know I'm proud of you. There it was again. The automatic assertion of pride without any evidence of understanding or interest. I'd heard those exact words from every family member whenever my career came up. I'm proud of you. Always stated as fact, never demonstrated through behavior, never followed by curiosity or questions, or genuine engagement with what my work actually involved. I set the phone aside and returned to my case files, but I found myself unable to concentrate. Something was bothering me beyond just the family dynamics, something about the timing and nature of last night's introduction disaster. The host hadn't simply forgotten to introduce me. She'd been given specific instructions about who to highlight and who to skip. Rachel had orchestrated every detail of that party with obsessive precision. She wouldn't have left introductions to chance. I opened my laptop and did something I'd never done before. I Googled myself. The results were illuminating. Page after page of articles about my appointment, interviews from legal journals, coverage of recent Supreme Court decisions, analysis of my judicial philosophy, speculation about my potential influence on future cases. The legal community had been paying attention to my work in ways that my family apparently never had. But more interesting were the local Portland media articles from around the time of my appointment. Portland's rising legal star, youngest justice in state history, environmental law expert joins Supreme Court. The coverage was extensive, respectful, and detailed. These weren't obscure legal trade publications. These were mainstream newspapers, local television coverage, the kind of media attention that most families would have saved and celebrated and shared. I searched for any mention of my family in these articles. Most focused solely on my legal background and judicial philosophy, but a few included brief personal details. Justice Chen comes from a family of successful Portland entrepreneurs, read one article. Her parents built the popular Chen Dynasty restaurant chain from a single location to 5 establishments throughout the metro area. The restaurants were mentioned. My parents' entrepreneurial success was highlighted. But nowhere in any of these articles was there a single quote from any family member. No proud statements from my parents, no excited comments from my sister, no family photos or celebration details. It was as if Maya the Supreme Court Justice and Maya the sister existed in completely separate universes, and my family had chosen to inhabit only one of them. I closed the laptop and sat back in my chair, processing this revelation. My appointment had been major news in Portland's legal and political circles. Judge Morrison's interest wasn't unusual. It was the norm. Legal professionals throughout the state had been following my career, reading my opinions, analyzing my judicial reasoning. But my own family had somehow managed to remain completely disconnected from all of this attention and respect. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that this disconnection was deliberate, not malicious, but intentional. My family had made a collective decision to treat my career as a private matter, something that belonged to Maya the individual rather than Maya the family member. They'd compartmentalized my professional success in a way that allowed them to be proud in theory while remaining uninvolved in practice. My phone rang, interrupting these thoughts. David Morrison's name appeared on the screen, which surprised me. We'd exchanged pleasantries at the party, but we weren't close enough for casual Sunday phone calls. "Maya," he said when I answered, "I hope you don't mind me calling. I got your number from Rachel. I wanted to apologize for last night." "Apologize for what?" "For not making sure my father knew about your position beforehand. For the awkward introduction situation. For..." He paused, searching for words. "For not realizing that your family doesn't really talk about your career the way other families would." The observation was tactful but pointed. "It's not your responsibility to manage my family's communication patterns, David." "Maybe not," he agreed, "but I feel like I contributed to an uncomfortable situation. My father was genuinely excited to meet you, and I should have made sure the introductions went smoothly." I found myself curious about his perspective. "How much did your father know about my appointment before last night?" "Everything," David said immediately. "He'd been following your career since your appointment was announced. He's read your opinions, discussed your cases with colleagues, even assigned some of your writings to law clerks as examples of clear judicial reasoning. When I told him Rachel's sister was a Supreme Court justice, he started planning questions he wanted to ask you about constitutional interpretation. The contrast was stark and painful. Judge Morrison, who'd never met me, had been following my career with professional interest and respect for 7 months. My own family, who saw me regularly, had never asked a single question about my work during that same period. "David," I said carefully, "when you told your parents about Rachel's family, how did you describe my career?" There was a long pause. "Honestly, I probably mentioned it the same way Rachel talks about it. Like it's something you do, but not necessarily something that defines who you are or what's important about you." "And how does Rachel talk about it?" Another pause. "Like it's impressive, but not really relevant to family stuff. Like you're still just Maya who keeps to herself and doesn't like to make a big deal about things." The conversation was confirming what I'd suspected but hadn't wanted to acknowledge. Rachel's perception of my career wasn't just ignorant, it was actively minimizing. She'd somehow convinced herself and everyone around her that my achievements weren't the kind of things worth celebrating or discussing, despite all evidence to the contrary. "David," I said, "do you understand what Supreme Court appointment represents in legal careers?" "I'm starting to," he admitted. "My father spent an hour last night explaining why he was so excited to meet you. Apparently, your environmental law background and your approach to constitutional interpretation have made you something of a rising star in judicial circles." Rising star. The phrase my family had never used, despite it appearing in multiple newspaper articles about my appointment. "And Rachel never mentioned any of this?" "No," David said quietly. "She talks about you like you're the responsible older sister who takes care of things but doesn't really want attention for it. Like your career is important to you personally but not something the family needs to focus on." The pattern was becoming clearer with each conversation. Rachel had created a narrative about me that served her own need to remain the center of family attention, while technically acknowledging my success. In her version of our family story, I was the quiet sister who preferred to stay in the background, who didn't want or need public recognition, who was content to let others shine while I handled my career privately. It was a convenient fiction that allowed everyone to avoid confronting the reality that my achievements were objectively more significant than anything else anyone in our family had ever accomplished. Not because other people's work wasn't valuable, but because Supreme Court appointment represents a level of professional recognition that occurs maybe once or twice in a generation within any given family. "Thank you for calling, David," I said finally. "And thank you for being honest about how my career has been presented to your family." "Maya," he said, "I hope this doesn't create problems between you and Rachel. She loves you. And she's proud of you. I think she just doesn't know how to process having a sister who's achieved something this significant." After hanging up, I sat in my quiet condo thinking about David's final observation. Rachel loved me and was proud of me, but she didn't know how to process my achievement. Which meant, essentially, that she'd chosen to not process it at all. To treat it as a fact that existed in the background of our relationship, but didn't require any adjustment in how she understood our family dynamics, or her own place within them. I thought about the 7 months since my appointment, reviewing family interactions through this new lens of understanding. Sunday dinners, where conversation focused on restaurant business, Rachel's marketing campaigns, various cousins' achievements, but never included questions about Supreme Court cases or judicial decisions. Holiday gatherings, where I was asked about my personal life, my dating prospects, my travel plans, but never about the constitutional questions I was grappling with or the legal precedents I was helping to establish. Family group chats where photos and articles about restaurant successes were shared enthusiastically, where Rachel's marketing wins were celebrated with emoji and congratulations, but where news coverage of my Supreme Court work was never mentioned, never shared, never acknowledged as worthy of family celebration. I'd participated in this pattern without fully recognizing it, allowing my professional life to remain separate from family life because it seemed easier, because it avoided making others uncomfortable, because I'd been conditioned to believe that demanding attention for my achievements would be selfish or inappropriate. But Judge Morrison's reaction last night had shown me how abnormal this separation was. In most families, Supreme Court appointment would be the achievement that everything else revolved around, the accomplishment that redefined how family members understood their collective success and social standing. The fact that my family had managed to avoid this recalibration wasn't admirable restraint, it was willful blindness. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother. "Hope you're having a restful Sunday, sweetie. Dad and I were wondering if you're free for dinner next week. We'd love to catch up." The message was warm and loving, exactly the kind of family connection I valued. But I found myself wondering what catching up would involve. Updates about the restaurants, discussion of Rachel's wedding planning, questions about my personal life, but probably no curiosity about the constitutional cases I was deciding, or the legal reasoning I was developing that would influence Oregon law for decades. I decided to test this theory. I'd love to have dinner. I just finished reviewing briefs for a fascinating case about Indigenous water rights that will probably set major precedent for environmental law throughout the Pacific Northwest. The response took longer than usual. Sounds very important. Looking forward to seeing you. Love you. Polite acknowledgement followed by immediate redirection. No follow-up questions. No curiosity about the case details. No recognition that, quote, setting major precedent for environmental law throughout the Pacific Northwest might be something worth discussing or celebrating. I set the phone aside and returned to my case files, but my concentration remained fractured. 7 months of this pattern, 7 months of family interactions where my professional life remained invisible, despite it being the most significant thing happening in any of our careers. 7 months of allowing this dynamic to continue, because I'd been too accommodating, too willing to prioritize family harmony over my own need for recognition and respect. Last night had changed something fundamental in how I understood these relationships, not just because of Judge Morrison's professional courtesy, but because of the stark contrast between how legal professionals treated my career and how my own family treated it. The people who understood the significance of Supreme Court service treated me with appropriate respect and interest. The people who'd known me my entire life treated my achievements as background noise. I thought about Rachel's engagement party, about the careful orchestration of every detail, about the expensive venue and the prominent guest list, and the elaborate celebration of a milestone that, while personally meaningful, was also relatively common. Thousands of people get engaged every day. Very few people get appointed to state Supreme Courts. But more than that, I thought about the systematic nature of how my career had been minimized. The introduction script that skipped over me entirely. The family conversations that never included questions about my work. The group chats that celebrated everyone else's achievements but ignored mine. The narrative that had been constructed about Maya. The quiet sister who didn't want attention, despite no evidence that I'd ever expressed such a preference. This wasn't accidental oversight or benign neglect. This was active management of family dynamics to ensure that certain achievements remained invisible while others were highlighted and celebrated. And I'd been complicit in it, accepting the role of the accomplished but invisible sister, because it seemed easier than demanding the recognition I'd earned. But Judge Morrison's confusion last night had shown me how strange this dynamic appeared to people outside the family system. His genuine surprise at discovering that the Supreme Court justice was the same person who'd been ignored during introductions. His professional respect for my work contrasted against my family's casual dismissal of my career. His assumption that judicial service would be something my family celebrated prominently. I opened my laptop again and began researching something I'd never thought to investigate before: how other families handled Supreme Court appointments. I found announcement photos, celebration articles, proud family statements, extensive coverage of not just the judicial appointees but their families' reactions and support. Justice Sarah Henderson's appointment to the Washington Supreme Court 2 years ago had included a celebration photo with 3 generations of her family, all wearing formal attire, all clearly participating in recognition of a major family achievement. Justice Michael Torres's appointment to the California Supreme Court had been accompanied by an interview with his parents, discussing their pride in his accomplishment and their understanding of its significance to his career and to the legal profession. These families understood that Supreme Court appointment wasn't just individual achievement, it was family achievement, something that reflected positively on everyone who'd supported and shaped the appointed justice's development. They celebrated it publicly, discussed it openly, treated it as the pinnacle professional accomplishment it actually was. I closed the laptop and walked back to my windows overlooking the river. Portland's legal community understood my achievement. Judicial colleagues like Judge Morrison understood its significance. Legal journalists and commentators followed my work with professional interest. Law students studied my opinions in constitutional law classes. But my own family had somehow convinced themselves that this level of professional recognition wasn't something that warranted sustained attention or celebration, or even basic curiosity about what my work involved. The realization was both painful and liberating. Painful because it confirmed that my family's treatment of my career wasn't just oversight or awkwardness. It was systematic minimization that served their own psychological needs while ignoring mine. Liberating because understanding the problem clearly was the first step toward deciding how to address it. I thought about David's phone call, about his honest assessment of how Rachel presented my career to his family. Like something I did, but not something that defined who I was or what was important about me. The phrasing revealed everything about how my family had categorized my professional success. It was a fact about me, like my height or my preference for certain foods, but not an achievement worthy of ongoing recognition or respect. This categorization allowed them to be technically proud while remaining practically uninvolved. They could say they supported my career while never asking about its challenges, or celebrating its victories, or understanding its impact. They could maintain their established family dynamics where Rachel remained the celebrated daughter, while I remained the responsible but unassuming older sister. But that dynamic depended on my continued willingness to accept invisibility, to prioritize family harmony over my own need for recognition, to allow my achievements to be minimized in service of everyone else's comfort. Last night had shown me that this accommodation wasn't necessary or healthy, or even particularly kind to anyone involved. Judge Morrison's reaction had revealed how strange my family's behavior appeared to people who understood professional achievement. His confusion wasn't just about Supreme Court service. It was about basic family dynamics, about how accomplishments were recognized and celebrated within family systems. I picked up my phone and scrolled through the family group chat, reviewing months of messages with new awareness. Photos of restaurant success, celebration of Rachel's marketing achievements, congratulations for various cousins' milestones, planning for family gatherings and celebrations. But nowhere in this extensive family communication was there any mention of Supreme Court cases, judicial decisions, legal precedents, or constitutional interpretation. It was as if Maya the Supreme Court justice existed in a completely separate universe from Maya the family member, and everyone had agreed to inhabit only the universe where my professional achievements remained invisible. I drafted several different messages to the family group chat, then deleted them all. Part of me wanted to share articles about my recent cases, to force acknowledgement of my professional success, to demand the kind of recognition that Judge Morrison had shown naturally and appropriately. But another part of me recognized that forcing recognition wouldn't create genuine respect or understanding. Instead, I began thinking about choices. I could continue participating in family dynamics that required me to minimize my achievements in order to maintain everyone else's comfort. I could accept being the accomplished but invisible sister because it preserved established roles and relationships. I could prioritize family harmony over my own need for recognition and respect. Or I could begin insisting that my professional life deserved the same kind of family attention and celebration that everyone else's achievements received. I could refuse to be invisible anymore, even if that created discomfort or forced difficult conversations about family dynamics and recognition patterns. The decision felt significant in ways that extended far beyond family relationships. For 7 months, I'd been allowing the most important achievement of my career to remain hidden from the people who claimed to love and support me. I'd been accepting a version of family love that required me to stay small, to avoid outshining others, to treat my success as something private, rather than something worthy of shared celebration. But love that required me to diminish myself wasn't really love at all. It was a transaction where I provided accommodation and invisible support, in exchange for inclusion in family relationships that never quite made space for who I actually was or what I'd actually accomplished. Judge Morrison had shown me what authentic professional respect looked like. David's phone call had revealed how abnormal my family's minimization appeared to people outside our established patterns. The legal community's coverage of my work had demonstrated that my achievements were objectively significant and worthy of recognition. The question now was whether I was ready to insist on that recognition within my own family, even if it meant disrupting comfortable dynamics and forcing everyone to recalibrate their understanding of who I was and what my success meant for our family's collective identity. I looked out at the Portland skyline, at the city where I was helping to shape legal precedent and constitutional interpretation, where my judicial opinions would influence law and policy for generations. This was meaningful work, important work, work that deserved respect and recognition from the people who claimed to care about me most. The time for invisible achievement and accommodating minimization was over. The question was how to begin claiming the space and recognition I'd earned without destroying the family relationships I still valued, despite their limitations. As I stood there watching the afternoon light change over the Willamette River, I began planning my response to 7 months of systematic invisibility. Not revenge, but recalibration. Not destruction, but honest recognition of what my achievements meant and what kind of family support I deserved. Monday morning brought the kind of revelation that changes everything. I was reviewing my calendar for the week when my judicial assistant, Caroline, knocked on my chamber's door with an expression that suggested something unusual had happened. "Justice Chen," she said, settling into the chair across from my desk. "I received an interesting call this morning from the Portland Business Journal. They want to do a feature story about your first year on the Supreme Court, particularly focusing on your environmental law decisions and their impact on state policy." I looked up from my case files with genuine surprise. "Did they say what prompted this interest?" Carolyn smiled knowingly. "Apparently, Judge Morrison mentioned your work at some kind of social event over the weekend. He spoke very highly of your constitutional interpretation methods and suggested you'd be an excellent subject for their Rising Leaders in Oregon Law series." The timing wasn't coincidental. Judge Morrison had been so impressed by our conversation at Rachel's party, and so apparently troubled by my family's dismissive treatment, that he'd taken it upon himself to generate positive professional attention for my work. It was an extraordinary gesture of collegial support, the kind of professional advocacy that happens when respected figures in the legal community want to elevate deserving colleagues. "The journalist Maria Santos seemed particularly interested in your background," Caroline continued. "She mentioned that most people don't realize how young you are or how significant your environmental law expertise has been in shaping recent Supreme Court decisions. She wants to do an in-depth profile, including interviews with legal scholars who follow your work." I felt a surge of professional pride mixed with something more complex. External validation of my work was gratifying, But it also highlighted the stark contrast between how the legal community viewed my achievements and how my family treated them. Maria Santos, a journalist I'd never met, understood the significance of my judicial service better than my own sister did. "There's more," Caroline said, consulting her notes. "The Oregon State Bar Association called this morning. They want to invite you to deliver the keynote address at their annual conference in September. The theme is Constitutional Innovation in Environmental Law, and they specifically mentioned your recent water rights decision as groundbreaking legal reasoning. 2 major professional opportunities in one morning, both stemming from Judge Morrison's advocacy after witnessing my family's treatment at the engagement party." The irony was profound. A federal judge I'd met once had done more to advance recognition of my work than my own family had accomplished in 7 months. "And," Caroline added with obvious pleasure, "Stanford Law Review wants to publish an article about your judicial philosophy. They're calling it The Chen Doctrine, Environmental Constitutionalism in State Supreme Court Jurisprudence. They want to feature it as the lead piece in their fall environmental law issue. The Chen Doctrine." Legal scholars were developing academic terminology around my judicial reasoning, treating my opinions as significant enough to warrant systematic analysis and theoretical framework development. This was the kind of professional recognition that most judges spent entire careers hoping to achieve, and it was happening in my first year on the bench. I leaned back in my chair, processing these developments. In the span of 72 hours, I'd gone from being the invisible sister at Rachel's engagement party to being courted by major legal publications and invited to deliver keynote addresses. The contrast revealed just how disconnected my family's perception was from my actual professional standing. "Caroline," I said slowly, "have any family members ever called the chambers asking about my work or schedule?" She looked surprised by the question. "No, Justice Chen, never. Should they have?" The answer confirmed what I'd suspected but hadn't wanted to acknowledge. In 7 months of Supreme Court service, during which I'd decided cases affecting millions of Oregonians and established legal precedents that would influence environmental law for decades, not one family member had ever shown enough curiosity about my work to contact my chambers with questions or expressions of interest. "What about media requests related to family background or personal life?" "A few, especially around the time of your appointment," Caroline replied. "Journalists wanted to interview family members about your background, your character, that sort of thing. But we were told by your family's representatives that they preferred to keep personal matters private and wouldn't be giving interviews." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "Family representatives?" Caroline consulted her files. "Your sister Rachel handled most of those requests. She said the family wanted to maintain their privacy and let your professional work speak for itself without personal publicity." So Rachel had actively prevented family members from participating in media coverage of my appointment, effectively ensuring that my professional achievements remained separate from any family recognition or celebration. She'd managed the situation to maintain their privacy while also maintaining my invisibility within family narratives. Did she give any specific reasons for declining media requests? She mentioned that the family had always been private people who didn't seek attention, and that you wouldn't want them making your appointment about the family rather than about your qualifications, Caroline said. She seemed very concerned about protecting your professional image from any suggestion that family connections had influenced your appointment. The explanation was sophisticated and manipulative in ways I was only beginning to understand. Rachel had used my professional integrity as justification for family invisibility, creating a narrative where publicity about family pride or celebration would somehow compromise the merit-based nature of my appointment. She'd convinced journalists and my own staff that family silence was what I wanted, when in reality I'd never been consulted about these decisions. "Caroline," I said carefully, "when those media requests came in, did anyone ask me directly about my preferences regarding family interviews?" She looked uncomfortable. "No, Justice Chen. We were told that Rachel was speaking for the family with your approval. We assumed you discussed it with them and decided on a unified approach to media relations. I had been managing my own media relations through the Supreme Court's Public Information Office, giving interviews about legal reasoning and judicial philosophy, while remaining completely unaware that Rachel was simultaneously shutting down any family-related coverage." She'd created parallel media strategies that kept my professional achievements separate from any family recognition or pride. The phone rang, interrupting these troubling revelations. Caroline answered, then handed me the receiver with raised eyebrows. Judge Morrison for you. Justice Chen, came the familiar voice. I hope you don't mind my calling directly. I wanted to follow up on our conversation Saturday evening and share some developments that might interest you. Of course, Judge Morrison. Thank you for calling. I've been thinking about our discussion, and frankly about the family dynamics I observed at the party, he said with characteristic directness. It struck me as unusual that someone of your professional stature would be so under-recognized within your own family circle. I found myself appreciating his straightforward approach. It's been an interesting dynamic to navigate. Well, I took the liberty of reaching out to some colleagues in the legal journalism community, Judge Morrison continued. I suggested they might want to feature your work more prominently. Your environmental law reasoning deserves broader attention, and frankly, your family should be bursting with pride about your achievements. That's very kind of you, Judge Morrison. Not kind, necessary, he corrected firmly. The legal community has been watching your work with great interest, Justice Chen. Your opinions are being cited in federal circuits. Your reasoning is influencing environmental law nationwide, and law schools are teaching your cases as examples of innovative constitutional interpretation. This level of impact in your first year on the bench is extraordinary. His words carried the weight of someone who understood judicial achievement from decades of experience. But more than that, he continued, I was troubled by what I witnessed Saturday evening. Professional accomplishment deserves family recognition and support. The fact that you're not receiving that recognition suggests a dynamic that might be worth addressing. I felt a surge of gratitude for his advocacy, mixed with embarrassment that my family's treatment had been so obvious to an outsider. I appreciate your concern, Judge Morrison. Justice Chen, may I speak frankly? In 30 years on the federal bench, I've seen many accomplished individuals struggle with family dynamics that don't accommodate their professional success. Sometimes families need external perspective to understand what they're overlooking. The observation was astute and diplomatically phrased. What would you suggest? I think your family might benefit from understanding how the legal community views your work, he said thoughtfully. Perhaps they need to hear from external sources about the significance of your achievements. People sometimes can't see what's right in front of them until others point it out. After ending the call, I sat in my chambers thinking about Judge Morrison's suggestion. External perspective to help my family understand what they were overlooking. Professional validation to counteract years of systematic minimization. Third-party recognition that might force acknowledgment of what I'd accomplished. I called Maria Santos at the Portland Business Journal directly. Ms. Santos, I said when she answered, I understand you're interested in doing a profile about my work on the Supreme Court. Justice Chen, yes, absolutely. Judge Morrison spoke very highly of your environmental law innovations. We'd love to feature your work in our upcoming issue on Oregon's rising legal leaders. I'm interested in participating, I said, but I'd like to suggest a particular angle for the story. I think it might be valuable to explore how judicial service affects family dynamics, how professional achievement at this level impacts personal relationships. There was a pause as she considered this. That's a fascinating angle. Most legal profiles focus exclusively on professional accomplishments, but the personal dimension could be really compelling. Are you thinking about the work-life balance challenges of Supreme Court service? More about how families process and support achievement at this level, I clarified. How professional recognition translates into family understanding and celebration, or sometimes doesn't. Interesting, Maria said, and I could hear her journalist instincts engaging. Would your family be willing to participate in interviews for this angle? That's exactly what I'm hoping to find out, I replied honestly. We scheduled the interview for later that week, and I spent the rest of Monday thinking about strategy. Not revenge against my family, but recalibration of how my achievements were perceived and discussed within family circles. Judge Morrison was right that external perspective might help them understand what they'd been overlooking. That evening, I did something unprecedented. I called my parents and asked if we could have dinner that week to discuss something important. Of course, sweetie, my mother said immediately. Is everything okay? You sound serious. Everything's fine, I assured her. I just have some professional developments I'd like to share with you and Dad. Things I think you'd find interesting. Professional developments? She repeated, and I could hear the slight confusion in her voice. Like what? I'd rather discuss it in person, I said. Are you free Wednesday evening? We arranged to meet at their house in Lake Oswego, the suburban home where I'd grown up, where family dynamics had been established over decades of shared meals and conversations. It felt appropriate to have this conversation in the space where my role as the responsible but invisible daughter had been so carefully maintained. Tuesday brought more professional opportunities. The American Bar Association called to invite me to participate in a panel discussion about environmental constitutional law at their national conference. Law and Order magazine wanted to feature me in their Judges Under 40 Inches spotlight. The University of Oregon Law School requested that I consider teaching a seminar on constitutional environmental interpretation as a visiting professor. Each opportunity reinforced the same message. My work was being recognized, celebrated, and studied by legal professionals nationwide. My judicial reasoning was influencing environmental law beyond Oregon's borders. My constitutional interpretation methods were being taught in law schools and cited in federal courts. But when I checked the family group chat Tuesday evening, the conversation focused on restaurant inventory challenges, Rachel's wedding venue tours, and Uncle Tony's new delivery system implementation. Not a single mention of Supreme Court cases, judicial recognition, or legal achievement. The parallel universes remained completely separate. I drafted a message to the group chat several times, then deleted each attempt. Part of me wanted to share the week's professional developments, to force acknowledgment of what was happening in my career, to demand the kind of family attention that these achievements deserved. But I realized that forcing recognition through group messages wouldn't create genuine understanding or respect. Instead, I began planning Wednesday's conversation with my parents. Not an attack on their previous behavior, but an honest presentation of what my career actually involved and what kind of family support I needed going forward. An opportunity for them to understand the disconnect between how the legal community viewed my work and how our family discussed it. Wednesday afternoon, I received a call from Rachel that suggested she'd heard about my upcoming media profile. Maya, she said, her voice carrying that careful tone she used when she was managing a delicate situation. I heard from someone that you're doing an interview with the Portland Business Journal? Yes, I replied simply. They're interested in featuring my work. That's wonderful, she said, but I could hear the underlying concern. What kind of angle are they taking? Just professional stuff or more personal background? Both, I said honestly. They're interested in how Supreme Court service affects family relationships and personal life. There was a long pause. Family relationships? How families process and support professional achievement at this level, I explained. How judicial service impacts family dynamics. Another pause, longer this time. Maya, you're not going to say anything about Saturday night, are you? About the introduction thing? Because that was just a misunderstanding, and it might reflect poorly on David's family if it seems like there was tension at the party. Her immediate concern was about protecting David's family from any suggestion of social awkwardness, not about understanding why the introduction situation had been problematic for me. I'm not planning to criticize anyone, Rachel. I'm just interested in discussing how professional achievement gets recognized and celebrated within family structures. But you won't mention specific incidents? I'll discuss general patterns and dynamics, I said. How families learn to understand and support career achievement in specialized fields. Okay, she said, but her voice remained tense. I just think it's important to be careful about how these things get presented in the media. You know how family stuff can get taken out of context. After we hung up, I realized that Rachel's primary concern wasn't about understanding my perspective or improving family dynamics. She was worried about public perception, about how family treatment of my career might reflect on everyone else if it became the subject of media attention. That evening, I drove to my parents' house in Lake Oswego, the tree-lined suburban neighborhood where successful Portland families lived quietly among manicured lawns and tasteful architecture. The Chen family home was comfortable and elegant, reflecting decades of restaurant business success and careful financial management. My parents were waiting with their usual warmth, hugs, and questions about my drive and offers of tea or coffee. We settled in their living room, the same space where we'd held countless family conversations over the years, where holiday celebrations had unfolded and life updates had been shared. "So what did you want to discuss, sweetheart?" my father asked, settling into his familiar armchair. "You said you had professional developments to share?" I took a breath and began with the simplest facts. This week, I received invitations to keynote the Oregon State Bar Association Conference, to participate in an American Bar Association panel at their national conference, and to teach as a visiting professor at University of Oregon Law School. Stanford Law Review wants to publish an article about my judicial philosophy, and several legal magazines are requesting feature interviews. My parents looked pleased but not particularly surprised. "That's wonderful, Maya," my mother said. "You've always been such an achiever." The Stanford Law Review article is titled "The Chen Doctrine," I continued. "Legal scholars are developing academic terminology around my judicial reasoning and constitutional interpretation methods." This information seemed to register differently. My father leaned forward with increased attention. "The Chen Doctrine? My environmental law decisions are being studied in law schools nationwide," I explained. "Federal courts are citing my opinions in their own environmental cases. Legal scholars are analyzing my constitutional reasoning as innovative and influential." The silence that followed was different from their usual polite acknowledgment. This was the silence of people beginning to understand that something significant was happening that they hadn't fully grasped before. "Maya," my mother said slowly, "are you saying that your work is being recognized nationally, not just in Oregon?" "Yes," I replied. "My judicial opinions are influencing environmental law throughout the United States. Law professors are teaching my cases as examples of constitutional innovation. Federal judges are citing my reasoning in their own decisions." My father was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. "And this is happening because of cases you've decided in your first year on the Supreme Court?" 7 months, I corrected gently. This level of recognition typically takes judges years to achieve, if they achieve it at all. Judge Morrison mentioned that most justices spend entire careers hoping for the kind of national attention my work is receiving. "Judge Morrison," my mother repeated. "From Saturday night?" "He's been following my career since my appointment," I explained. When he realized at Rachel's party that I was the Supreme Court justice he'd been reading about, he was surprised by how little the family seemed to know about my professional recognition. The room went very quiet. My parents exchanged looks that suggested they were beginning to understand that something important had been overlooked or misunderstood. "Maya," my father said carefully, "when you say professional recognition, what exactly do you mean?" For the next hour, I walked them through the reality of my judicial career. The cases that had garnered national attention, the legal scholars who followed my work, the law schools teaching my opinions, the federal courts citing my reasoning, the bar associations requesting my participation in major conferences. I showed them articles from legal journals, excerpts from law review analyses of my decisions, emails from prominent constitutional law professors, requesting meetings to discuss my judicial philosophy. I explained the significance of Supreme Court appointment in legal careers, the rarity of achieving national recognition so quickly, the impact my environmental law reasoning was having on constitutional interpretation throughout the country. With each piece of evidence, I watched my parents' understanding shift. Not just pride in my general success, but genuine comprehension of what I'd accomplished and what it meant within legal professional circles. "Why didn't we know about this?" my mother asked finally, her voice small. "Because no one ever asked," I replied honestly. "And because whenever my career came up in family conversations, it was treated as something I did privately rather than something worth discussing or celebrating as a family achievement." "But you never talked about it," my father protested. "You never brought up these developments at Sunday dinners or family gatherings." "I didn't think anyone was interested," I said. When I mentioned work at family events, the conversation always moved quickly to other topics. When I tried to share professional developments, they were acknowledged briefly and then forgotten. I learned to keep my career separate from family life because it seemed like that's what everyone preferred. The silence that followed was heavy with recognition and regret. My parents were beginning to understand that their lack of curiosity about my work hadn't been respectful restraint. It had been inadvertent dismissal of the most significant achievement in our family's history. "Maya," my mother said quietly, "we've made a terrible mistake." The conversation that followed was painful but necessary. My parents began to understand how their treatment of my career had appeared to others, how Judge Morrison's confusion at the engagement party reflected a broader disconnect between my professional standing and my family recognition. They started asking questions they should have asked months ago. About specific cases, about constitutional interpretation, about the intellectual challenges of Supreme Court service, about what it felt like to establish legal precedent that would influence law for generations. As I answered their questions, I watched them realize how much they'd missed, how many opportunities for family celebration and pride they'd overlooked, how systematically they'd managed to remain disconnected from the most important work of my life. "We need to fix this," my father said finally. "We need to understand what you do and support it properly. This kind of achievement deserves family recognition and celebration." "But how do we fix 7 months of getting it wrong?" my mother asked. "How do we make up for not understanding or celebrating what you've accomplished?" I looked at these two people who'd raised me, supported my education, and somehow managed to miss the significance of my life's greatest achievement. Not from malice, but from a combination of ignorance and habit and the comfortable assumption that my career would take care of itself, while family attention focused on more accessible accomplishments. "We start by changing how we talk about my work going forward," I said. "We start by asking questions and showing interest and treating my professional life as something worth family discussion and celebration." "What about Rachel?" my mother asked quietly. "She's been managing a lot of the family communications, and I think she might not understand any of this either." I thought about Rachel's phone call earlier that day, her immediate concern about media coverage, her worry about protecting David's family from any suggestion of tension at the engagement party. Rachel will need to have her own conversation about this. But that's between her and me. My father nodded slowly. "Maya, I need to ask you something difficult. Do you feel like we've failed you as parents by not recognizing what you've achieved?" The question hung in the air between us, heavy with decades of family history and 7 months of professional invisibility. "I feel like we've all learned something important about communication and recognition and support," I said finally. "And I feel like we have the opportunity to do better going forward." When I left their house that evening, something fundamental had shifted in our family dynamics. Not complete transformation, but the beginning of honest recognition and understanding. My parents finally comprehended what I'd accomplished and what kind of family support my career deserved. The question now was whether that understanding would translate into lasting change, and whether Rachel would be willing to have a similar conversation about how professional achievement gets recognized and celebrated within our family system. The Portland Business Journal article published on Friday morning, with a headline that made my heart race, "The Silent Achiever: How Oregon's Youngest Supreme Court Justice Navigates Family Expectations and Professional Excellence." Maria Santos had crafted a masterful piece that explored the disconnect between professional recognition and family dynamics without directly criticizing anyone, instead letting the contrast speak for itself. The article opened with Judge Morrison's praise for my constitutional reasoning, quoted law professors who called my environmental decisions groundbreaking, and detailed the national attention my work was receiving. But the most powerful section focused on family dynamics, including carefully chosen quotes from my interview about how professional achievement sometimes challenges established family roles. "Success at this level can be isolating," the article quoted me saying. "When your work exists in a specialized field, family members don't always understand its significance or know how to celebrate it appropriately. There's often a learning curve for everyone involved." The piece included a sidebar listing my major accomplishments: youngest Supreme Court justice in Oregon history, national recognition for environmental law innovation, federal court citations of my opinions, academic articles about my judicial philosophy, and invitations to speak at major legal conferences. The visual impact was striking. seeing my achievements listed comprehensively in a way that made their significance undeniable. But what made the article truly effective was its subtle exploration of how families process professional success. Maria had interviewed several other prominent Oregon professionals about their experiences with family recognition, creating a broader context that made my situation feel universal rather than uniquely problematic. Dr. Patricia Kim, a renowned cardiac surgeon, was quoted discussing how her family had struggled to understand the significance of her medical innovations. My parents knew I was a doctor, but they didn't grasp what it meant when I developed a new surgical technique that was being used nationwide. They were proud, but they didn't know how to talk about it or celebrate it. The article resonated throughout Oregon's professional community. By noon Friday, my chambers had received calls from colleagues offering congratulations, not just on the recognition, but on the honest discussion of family dynamics that many legal professionals had experienced themselves. Caroline brought me a stack of messages from judges, attorneys, and law professors who had read the article and wanted to share their own experiences with family recognition challenges. Justice Chen, she said, I think you've touched on something that a lot of successful professionals deal with but rarely discuss publicly. The most significant call came from Rachel at 2 o'clock Friday afternoon. Her voice was tight with emotions I couldn't quite identify. Maya, I read the article, she said without preamble. We need to talk. I agree, I replied. When would be convenient? Now, she said. I'm in the parking garage outside your building. Can you come down? I found Rachel sitting in her car, still wearing her work clothes but looking more disheveled than I'd ever seen her. Her eyes were red, her hair was slightly messy, and she clutched a printed copy of the article in her hands. Get in, she said when she saw me approaching. I settled into the passenger seat, and we sat in silence for a moment. The underground parking garage felt like an appropriate setting for this conversation, removed from the public spaces where our family drama had been playing out. I had no idea, Rachel said finally. I mean, I knew your job was important, but I didn't understand that people were writing about you like this, that you were influencing law nationwide. I tried to tell you, I said gently, multiple times over the past 7 months. No, you mentioned work stuff, but you never explained that you were becoming famous in legal circles. You never said that law schools were teaching your cases or that federal judges were citing your opinions. I looked at her carefully. Rachel, every time I brought up my work, you changed the subject. Every time I mentioned a case or a legal development, you responded with something about the restaurants or your marketing campaigns. I learned to stop trying. She was quiet for a long moment, staring at the printed article. The journalist interviewed Mom and Dad yesterday. They called me afterward, and Mom was crying. She said they'd had no idea how significant your work was, how much recognition you were receiving. What did you tell them? I told them the truth, Rachel said, her voice breaking slightly. That I'd been treating your career like it was just a job, not like it was the most important thing anyone in our family had ever accomplished. That I'd been so focused on my own stuff that I never bothered to understand what you were actually doing. The admission hung between us in the enclosed space of the car. Rachel, why did you handle the media requests about my appointment without consulting me? Why did you tell journalists that the family preferred privacy? She looked genuinely confused. Because I thought that's what you'd want. You never seemed to want attention for your work. You always kept it separate from family stuff. I kept it separate because every time I brought it up, you made it clear that family time wasn't for discussing work. You created an environment where my career felt unwelcome in family conversations. But you never said you wanted to talk about it more, she protested. Rachel, I shouldn't have to ask my own family to be interested in my career. When someone gets appointed to the Supreme Court, the normal family response is curiosity, questions, celebration. Not polite acknowledgement followed by immediate subject changes. She was crying now, tears streaming down her face as she processed what I was saying. I thought you were being modest. I thought you didn't want to make a big deal about it. Why would I not want to make a big deal about the biggest achievement of my life? Because you never make a big deal about anything, she said through her tears. You've always been the quiet one, the one who takes care of things without wanting credit. I thought this was just another example of that. I felt a surge of frustration mixed with sadness. Rachel, being quiet doesn't mean being invisible. Being humble doesn't mean my achievements don't deserve family recognition. I've been quiet because I learned that demanding attention in our family was pointless, not because I didn't want or need recognition. I've ruined everything, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. David's parents think our family is weird because we don't celebrate your success. Judge Morrison must think we're awful people. And now it's in the newspaper that we don't understand what you've accomplished. The article doesn't criticize anyone, I said honestly. It just explores how families navigate professional success. But Rachel, this isn't about what other people think. It's about what I need from my own family. She wiped her eyes and looked at me directly for the first time since I'd gotten in the car. What do you need? How do we fix this? I need you to understand that my career isn't separate from our family. It's part of who I am, and it deserves the same kind of attention and celebration that we give to restaurant successes or your marketing achievements. I need you to ask questions, show interest, and acknowledge that what I do matters. But I don't understand legal stuff, she said. I don't know how to talk about constitutional law or judicial opinions. You don't need to be an expert to show interest, I replied. You just need to ask questions and listen to the answers. When I mention a case, you could ask what it was about or why it was important. When I talk about Supreme Court work, you could ask how it feels or what the biggest challenges are. Rachel nodded slowly. I can do that. I want to do that. I've been so focused on my own life that I didn't realize how much I was missing about yours. There's something else, I said carefully. The engagement party introductions. That wasn't an accident. She looked stricken. Maya, I didn't mean for it to be hurtful. I told the coordinator to focus on the restaurant business and the family's entrepreneurial success, because I thought that's what would be most interesting to the guests. But you specifically told her to skip over me. I told her you were private about your work and wouldn't want professional attention at a family celebration, she admitted. I thought I was protecting you from unwanted spotlight. Rachel, being introduced as a Supreme Court justice at a formal event isn't unwanted spotlight. It's appropriate recognition. And more importantly, it's not your decision to make. I know that now, she said miserably. When Judge Morrison asked about meeting you, I realized how stupid I'd been. Here was this important federal judge who was excited to meet you, and I'd made sure no one even knew who you were. We sat in silence for a moment, both processing the weight of these revelations. Rachel's management of my visibility hadn't been malicious, but it had been presumptuous and ultimately harmful. Maya, she said finally, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. Do you hate me? The question caught me off guard. Rachel, I don't hate you, I love you, but I've been hurt by how invisible you've made me feel, and I've been frustrated by your assumption that you knew what I wanted without ever asking. I've been a terrible sister, she said quietly. You've been a sister who made mistakes, I corrected. But we can fix this if you're willing to change how you think about my career and my needs. I want to fix it, she said immediately. I want to understand your work and celebrate it properly. I want to be the kind of sister who asks questions and shows interest and makes sure you feel supported. Then we start now, I said. Tell me about your biggest concern regarding my career. She thought for a moment. Honestly, I'm worried that you're too good at what you do, that you're so successful that you're going to outgrow our family, that you'll realize we're not sophisticated enough or smart enough to deserve your attention. The admission revealed insecurities I hadn't suspected. Rachel, professional success doesn't change who I am or what I value. I've always wanted to share my achievements with my family, not use them to separate myself from you. But you're going to be famous, she said. You're already being written about in magazines and invited to speak at conferences. You're becoming someone important. I've always been someone important, I replied. I'm your sister. That's the most important thing about me, not my career achievements. But I need my career achievements to be recognized and celebrated within our family, not treated as separate from our relationships. The conversation continued for another hour, covering years of family dynamics, missed opportunities for connection, and misunderstood intentions. Rachel began to understand that my professional success was something I wanted to share with the family, not something I wanted to keep private and separate. By the time we left the parking garage, we'd established new ground rules for family communication. Rachel would ask questions about my work, show interest in my cases, and help ensure that my achievements received appropriate family recognition. I would be more direct about my needs and expectations, rather than assuming my family would intuitively understand how to support my career. The following week brought a series of family changes that felt like recalibration rather than revolution. My parents called twice to ask about specific Supreme Court cases they'd read about in the newspaper. Uncle Tony mentioned my environmental law work at Sunday dinner and asked thoughtful questions about water rights and constitutional interpretation. Aunt Susan apologized for calling my career a little job and asked if she could read some of my judicial opinions. Most significantly, Rachel began managing family communications differently. When the Oregon State Bar Association sent a formal invitation for me to keynote their annual conference, Rachel shared it in the family group chat with enthusiastic congratulations. When Stanford Law Review published the Chen Doctrine article, she posted about it on her social media with obvious pride. The transformation wasn't complete or perfect, but it was genuine. My family began treating my career as something worthy of ongoing attention and celebration, rather than something to be acknowledged briefly and then forgotten. The real test came 2 months later at Uncle Tony's birthday celebration. This time, when prominent Portland business leaders were present, Rachel introduced me as my sister Maya, who serves on the Oregon Supreme Court and is becoming nationally recognized for her environmental law expertise. The conversations that followed were natural and comfortable. I discussed recent cases with interested family friends, explained constitutional interpretation to curious relatives, and answered questions about judicial service without feeling like I was imposing unwanted professional content on a family gathering. Judge Morrison attended the celebration as David's guest, and this time his interaction with my family was completely different. My parents engaged him in detailed discussion about my work, Rachel asked informed questions about federal versus state judicial systems, and Uncle Tony proudly shared articles about my recent legal victories. Justice Chen, Judge Morrison said privately during the evening, "It's remarkable to see how your family has developed such genuine understanding and appreciation for your work. The contrast with your sister's engagement party is striking." "We've all learned a lot about communication and recognition over the past few months," I replied. "Professional achievement requires family support to be truly fulfilling," he observed. "You've created an environment where your success can be properly celebrated and understood." As the evening wound down, Rachel approached me with an expression I recognized from childhood when she wanted to share something important. "Maya," she said, "I have something to tell you. David and I have been talking, and we want to ask you to officiate our wedding ceremony." The request caught me completely off guard. "Rachel, I'm not ordained to perform marriages." "But you're a Supreme Court justice," she said with a smile. "You can get temporarily authorized to perform weddings." We looked it up. "And we want our marriage to be officiated by the most accomplished person in our family." The gesture was meaningful beyond the practical request. Rachel was asking me to use my judicial authority to formalize her marriage, making my professional position central to one of her life's most important moments. "Are you sure?" I asked. "It's a big responsibility." "I'm sure," she said firmly. "I want our wedding to be officiated by Oregon Supreme Court Justice Maya Chen, who happens to be my brilliant older sister." The wedding took place 6 months later at the same Riverside Country Club where Rachel's engagement party had revealed so much about family dynamics. But this time, my role was unmistakably central. I wore my judicial robes, carried the authority of the Supreme Court, and spoke to the assembled guests about the constitutional principles underlying marriage law. The ceremony was beautiful, meaningful, and completely different from what might have happened if our family conversations had never taken place. Rachel's wedding became a celebration not just of her marriage, but of how families can grow and change and learn to recognize what truly matters. During the reception, I found myself standing at the same floor-to-ceiling windows where I'd felt so invisible months earlier. But now I was surrounded by family members asking about my recent cases, legal colleagues discussing constitutional interpretation, and friends celebrating both Rachel's marriage and my judicial achievements. Judge Morrison approached me one final time during the evening, Justice Chen, he said, I want you to know that your family's transformation has been remarkable to witness. They've learned to appreciate what they have in you. We've all learned, I replied. Sometimes it takes outside perspective to see what's right in front of you. Indeed, he agreed, and sometimes it takes courage to demand the recognition you deserve. As I watched Rachel and David dance their first dance as a married couple, I reflected on how much had changed since that night when I'd felt invisible at her engagement party. Not just in how my family treated my career, but in how I understood my own worth and what I deserved from the people who claimed to love me. The legal community's recognition of my work had given me the confidence to demand appropriate family recognition. Judge Morrison's advocacy had shown me what genuine professional respect looked like. The media attention had forced honest conversations about family dynamics and mutual support. But most importantly, I'd learned that love requires more than good intentions. It requires attention, curiosity, celebration, and the willingness to grow and change when you realize you've been getting something important wrong. My family had learned to see me clearly, not as the quiet sister who preferred to stay in the background, but as the accomplished professional who deserved recognition and celebration for extraordinary achievements. And I'd learned to advocate for myself, to demand the respect I'd earned, and to refuse to accept invisibility in service of everyone else's comfort. The Chen family had grown into something better, something more honest and supportive and genuinely celebratory of everyone's achievements. And Oregon Supreme Court Justice Maya Chen had finally claimed her rightful place not just in legal history, but in her own family's understanding of success and worth. Standing there in my judicial robes, watching my sister celebrate her new marriage, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from being fully seen and appreciated by the people who matter most. The invisible daughter had become visible, not through demand or manipulation, but through honest communication and the courage to insist on the recognition she deserved. The transformation had been worth every difficult conversation, every moment of discomfort, every risk taken in service of authentic family relationships. Because love that requires you to stay small isn't really love at all, and recognition that comes only from strangers isn't sufficient for a life well lived. I had both now, professional respect from the legal community and genuine family appreciation for who I was and what I'd accomplished. The balance felt perfect, sustainable, and deeply satisfying in ways that invisible achievement never could. The evening ended with Rachel's bouquet toss, which she aimed directly at me with a mischievous grin. As I caught the flowers, surrounded by family members who finally understood and celebrated my success, I felt complete in a way I'd never experienced before. The Supreme Court Justice and the beloved sister had finally become the same person, and our family had learned to honor both versions of who I was. The transformation was complete, the recognition was genuine, and the future looked bright with possibilities for continued growth and mutual celebration. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.